After making a few different types of shirtwaists, my 1890s wardrobe was in desperate need of cold weather wear and the distinct, interesting bodices that were so prevalent. Seriously, late 1800s to early 1900s bodices are abundant on eBay and Etsy in a wide variety of styles and fabrics. Many of these bodices make use of small amounts of contrasting fabrics and lush trims. Fashion illustrations show that these bodices can match, coordinate, or contrast with the skirts. I'll take you step by step through the process of making an 1890s bodice using historically accurate techniques. Bodices from 1890 to 1910 were usually constructed with a fitted, boned lining. Most often they would close at center front, sometimes with a plastron or fabric panel that concealed the closure. Evening and low neckline bodices usually closed at the center back. I was really intrigued by bodices with that center front plastron framed by lapels. I also liked the curved pointed hem that extended over the hips, which was called a basque bodice in patterns and magazines of that time. The basque bodice was more popular in the 1880s and early 1890s than at the turn of the century, but patterns for basic basque bodices were published in the Delineator magazine until 1902, when the drapey, full pigeon breast look took over tailored styles. Interestingly, the basque bodice appears multiple times in the Delineator with the claim that it's suitable for elderly and stout women, but I think this is a style flattering for all body types. Inspired by several original 1890s bodices and patterns, my final design was a dark green wool bodice with black velvet lapels and collar that framed a pleated plastron of green and red plaid silk. The basque bodice with barely puffed sleeves lines up with fashion designs from 1898 and 1899. I'm using secondhand materials for this entire project because I bought a lot of high-quality fabric scraps at a local estate sale last year, and some of these fabrics coordinated perfectly together. I'm using a vintage cotton sateen for the lining. For the pattern, I'm using Laughing Moon 103, which includes a few different 1890s bodices. The drafting and shapes of this pattern are excellent, and I've used it as a base for several 1890s and even 1880s bodices. I combined the pointed bodice hem of views B, C, F with the full bodice of view D. I also used the view D sleeves since I didn't have enough fabric for the gigot sleeves in view A. On my mock-up, I shortened the pattern along the shortened line. However, I should have instead shortened it above the bust, as the final bodice has excess fabric in the bust area and the darts are too low, even with generous bust pads. I only made a mock-up of the lining and tried my best to draft the plastron and lapels. This bodice, like most originals I've seen, has 2 front pieces, 2 backs, and 4 side back pieces. I modified the bodice fronts to have an extension for the turn back of the lapels. If you're not adapting this pattern to have lapels, you can place the center front edge on the selvage of your fabric. I placed the center front of my bodice lining on the selvage. I cut all my pieces along the lengthwise grain of the fabric, but there was some debate as to the grain line of pieces in the 1890s. In 1899, the Delineator said, in cutting, the body portions of cotton linings are sometimes cut crosswise, the lengthwise threads being stronger than the crosswise and consequently better able to sustain the strain of the body. Sleeve linings are cut lengthwise, silk linings being narrower than the cotton linings are always cut lengthwise. By 1905, Butterick, which owned the Delineator magazine, said that cutting linings on the cross grain didn't have an advantage. The argument is that the completed lining will not stretch and that it is not so likely to split. A correctly fitted and boned lining will stretch very little, if any. With my bodice and lining pieces cut out and marked, I'm ready to baste each lining piece to its corresponding outer piece. Bodices and some lined waists were flat-lined, with exposed seams on the inside of the garment to make alterations easier. Clothing for theater and TV is still made this way today. I have 2 cats and their hair gets everywhere, so I lint rolled my pieces before basting them together. I'll flatline the bodice front pieces later, as those require extra preparation for the lapels. I prefer to assemble the back of the bodice first. Starting at the center back, I match up my markings and baste the pieces together before sewing them on the machine. I'm making sure that I sew each panel in the same direction from the neck to the waist to minimize warping. The Delineator says, "There is no more difficult branch of dressmaking than that which is embodied in the making of a perfectly plain, close-fitting basque. Here, even the smallest and apparently least significant detail has to be carefully considered if a satisfactory result is to be obtained." With the back pieces sewn together, I firmly pressed open each seam. This wooden clapper was helpful. I also pressed from the right side of the bodice. My preferred method is to use rayon seam binding to finish the seams. It's easy to use, relatively inexpensive, and is similar to the fine ribbon that was used. Cut notches at the waist and where the curved seam allowance doesn't lie flat. Fold and press the seam binding in half, then wrap the binding around the raw edges of the seam allowance. The binding is then sewn on with running stitches. You can whip stitch the raw edges instead of binding them, or use pinking shears if your fabric doesn't fray. From the book Dressmaking Up to Date by Butterick in 1905, some dressmakers prefer to overcast the seams, and most of the imported French dresses are finished in this way. But it does not present as neat a finish and occupies a great deal of time, as the overcasting must be done closely and very neatly. Now to work on the bodice front. I decided to use canvas interfacing to better support the lapels. My canvas interfacing pieces were cut without seam allowance and carefully aligned on the inside of the bodice front. The canvas stops at the top of the bust darts. This was only my second time tailoring, so this part is less of a tutorial and more an experiment. I sewed the canvas down by hand, being careful that my stitches didn't show on the right side of the fabric. Then I pad stitched the canvas following modern tutorials with rows of alternating diagonal stitches. I also added a linen tape at the roll line. In the end, I think I could have gone without the interfacing. Either I didn't do it properly or the difference it made was negligible in the finished bodice. I ended up tacking down my lapels when my bodice was complete anyway. Before I pinned on the contrast velvet lapels, I placed them on the bodice to make sure I had them oriented correctly. The lapels were then basted and sewn right sides together. To reduce bulk, I trimmed the seam allowances and clipped the upper curve of the lapel. I drafted the lapel to have a curved rather than straight upper edge for extra drama. In hindsight, this inverted curve at the top of the lapel is a detail I shouldn't have bothered with. It's not as common as the straight lapel and was really tricky to turn right side out. Next, I worked on the bodice front lining. Following the guidance of the 1905 book Dressmaking Up to Date, I folded in the front edge of the lining on the pattern's center front marking and stitched about 1/4 of an inch away from the fold to make a bone casing. Later on, hooks and eyes will be sewn along this edge and the selvage will be sewn down over them. But first, the lining is flat-lined to the bodice front. I basted the pieces together except at the center front edge. I transferred the markings for the darts and basted along the dart lines to help keep the fabric aligned properly when I sewed the darts. The darts were pressed and then trimmed. I carefully pressed the open darts over a pressing ham so that the bodice would take on the proper curved shape. I ended up trimming down the dart seam allowance a bit more, to about 1/4 of an inch, so that the seam allowances didn't overlap and create extra bulk. Then I finished the raw edges of the darts with seam binding. Getting the seam binding into the upper corner of the darts was very tricky. Next time, I think I'll go back to the mid-19th century method of just pressing the untrimmed dart to one side and creating a boning channel in the seam allowance of the dart. That method is so much faster and neater for me. Now we're ready to join the bodice fronts to the bodice back. I like to think of late 19th century sewing projects like this as assembling the different component parts individually and then gradually combining them to make the garment. To help keep all my layers of fabric in place while sewing, I used a walking foot attachment on my machine. I pressed open and clipped the seam allowance. At this point, you could baste your side seams and shoulder seams for a quick try-on and make adjustments before you clip the seam allowance. Then sew seam binding onto the seam allowances or use the seam finish of your choice. Now to sew the hooks and eyes on the lining. I marked the placement of the hooks and eyes 1 inch apart. From Dressmaking Up to Date, place a bone in the casing made at each of the front edges, allowing it to reach to about the same height as the bone in the dart seam. Spread the back part of each hook and sew them on, alternating a hook and an eye as seen in number 18. Place the hooks well inside the edge and sew through the 2 rings at the back, and also around the hook end, sewing this to the row of stitching near the edge. Sew completely through, allowing the stitches to show on the outside of the lining. Be sure to place the bone in the front before sewing the hooks and eyes on the lower part of the fronts. Observe care in sewing the hooks and eyes on the second side of the front that they shall be in exactly corresponding positions to those sewed on the first side. Turn under a seam at the edge of the facing piece and hem it over the first row of stitching, covering the sewed parts of the hooks and eyes. This method really intrigued me, and it gave such a neat and clean finish. I suppose you could just hem the selvage over the hooks if you had 1/2 inch seam allowance instead of 1 inch. Another option is to cover the hooks and eyes with seam binding or a small facing. From the Delineator, apply a silk facing to the edge, slipping it under the hooks, or use a row of Prussian binding instead of the silk, and full it on slightly to prevent the front edges drawing in. There was a lot of advice in the manuals about working with boning, but those dealt with whale bones, the baleen from whale mouths, and included soaking and steaming the bones, piercing them, or working with prepared bones in special casings. I'm using plastic synthetic whalebone from Burnley and Trowbridge, and I made boning casings from the rayon seam binding. To determine the size of the bones, I followed these instructions. From 5 inches above the waistline is the rule, to 1/4 inch above the finished edge of the waist. And by finished edge of the waist, they mean the bottom edge of the bodice. Additionally, the bones under the arm must not come nearer than 2 inches of the sleeve. In the darts, have the bone end 1 inch below the casing. Many sources advise scrunching up the bone casing a bit, especially near the waist. Sew the casing with running stitches to the seam allowances, holding the casing somewhat full and keeping it over the middle of the seam. From the book Home Dressmaking, published in 1892, whatever is used for these casings, they must be fulled on almost in gathers. The casings full and the bones tight will straighten the seams of any bodice and defy wrinkles at the waist. What I didn't understand until later is that you should sew on the casing first without the bone in it, and then insert the bone and close up the casing. It was tricky to lightly gather the casing with the bone inside. To prepare the bodice for the plastron, I sewed the free edge of the lapel to the interlining with a catch stitch. I couldn't find instructions specifically on how to sew a plastron under a lapel, so I'm making it up as I go along here. I made a quick mock-up of the plastron, which will be gathered at the neckline and pleated at the bottom, like many originals I saw. The stacked knife pleats will be about 5 inches tall. I decided to make my plastron 2 pieces that meet at the center front edge of the bodice, rather than a single piece plastron that wrapped over the center front lining closure and fastened on the side. I began by hemming the front edges of the plastron with a small whip stitch. Thankfully, the busy plaid pattern of the silk easily disguised any stitches. I then pressed the knife pleats into each panel, fanning them out slightly towards the top. And then a quick check to make sure the pleated panels fit between the lapels and center front lining closure. Then I sewed 2 rows of gathering stitches by hand along the top of each panel. I was afraid to pierce or snag the silk fabric on my sewing machine. I pinned the panels in place, making sure they overlapped the center front edge slightly to make the opening appear seamless. I whip stitched the front edges of the panels to the lining. This felt like doing a prick stitch on the neckline of an 18th century gown. Then I carefully stitched across each pleat, making a back stitch at each fold, trying to keep the stitches invisible. My rows of stitching were about 1 inch apart, Then I secured the thread on the lining with a back stitch. I tacked down the other side of each panel, tucking it underneath the catch stitch edge of the lapel, thus securing the plastron panels and lapels in one stitch. I also basted the gathered part of the plastron to the lining, adjusting the gathers to fit the neckline. Because of the complexity of these bodices, the bottom edges were finished with a facing. The dressmaker suggests sewing an inch-wide bias strip of soft crinoline around the bottom of the waist, 3/8 of an inch from its lower edge on the inside. I didn't have any soft crinoline, and the horsehair canvas I did have seemed too stiff, so I skipped this step. The benefits of having crinoline in the bodice hem also wasn't clear, and there were already so many layers to wrangle. Continuing the instructions, turn the edge of the waist under a seam's width and catch stitch it to the crinoline. I trimmed the seam allowances before folding up the hem edge and catch stitching it to the lining. It was so difficult to do this at the center front of the bodice. I wonder if I should have hemmed the lapel separately or something, because turning under that small bit of bulky velvet and wool was infuriating. The hem facing could be made of the same fabric as the bodice or lining, or with coordinating silk. I made my hem facing from the green wool, but a silk taffeta would have been much easier to sew around that wonky center front area. I cut 2 bias strips and sewed them together at a 90-degree angle to shape the facing at the center back point. From Suggestions for Dressmakers, published in 1896, facings for the inner side of the bottom of bodices and sleeves should be of silk always and on the bias. The facings sit better if the edges are turned in and they are hemmed down in long hemming stitches instead of being run on and turned up and fell down. That's a lot of directions, but basically they're saying sewing the facing on with whip stitches is easier and neater than sewing the facing to the bodice right sides together and then flipping the facing up onto the lining. Moving on to the next component, the sleeves. I flatlined the sleeves with the brown cotton sateen. I like that the Laughing Moon 103 pattern has a shaped 2-piece sleeve. It's historically accurate and allows for a better fit. However, I had to size down in the sleeves, and I think the finished sleeve is still too roomy at the forearm. I left the extra seam allowance in case I change my mind later. Perhaps the super tight lower sleeves is more of an illusion in fashion plates than reality. I sewed the upper sleeve and lower sleeve pieces together and finished the seam allowances with the seam binding. The pattern has 2 slits at the wrist, presumably to help when putting on the bodice, but I just used 1 slit since my sleeves weren't that tight. I also drafted my own bias facing instead of using the sleeve facing provided with the pattern. I pressed in the seam allowance along one long edge of the sleeve facing, then pinned the other long edge to the bottom of the sleeve, right sides together. I made sure to fold back the seam allowance of the slit before sewing on the facing. Then I pressed open the seam allowance and trimmed it to reduce bulk. The facing was then flipped to the inside and sewn to the sleeve lining with whip stitches. This is a bit different than the method in Dressmaking Up to date, which is more like facing the bodice hem. An interlining of plain crinoline is placed in the bottom, 1 to 2 inches deep. Turn the sleeve inside out and turn up the bottom 3/8 of an inch. Cat stitch this to hold it down, then press. Face the wrist with a bias piece of silk and slip stitch or hem at the upper and lower edges. Any embellishment or trimming is added and the sleeve fully finished before it is basted in the armhole. My sleeve has no trimming, so I can get right to sewing it into the armhole. I sewed the shoulder seams and finished them with rayon seam binding. Then I matched up the markings and pulled the gathering stitches at the top of the sleeve to fit it into the armhole. After the sleeve was sewn on, I finished the seam allowance with, you guessed it, seam binding. The Delineator shares a few other methods. The armholes may be overcast if the material is heavy, or they may be finished with a bias strip of the lining material, one edge of which may be sewed in with the sleeve, while the other edge is turned over and hemmed to the sleeve. To prevent the armhole from stretching, as it is likely to do in loosely woven fabrics, sew in a linen tape with the sleeve, placing it on the armhole edge of the waist and overcasting it with the edges. Making the collar was my favorite part of this project. The collar in Laughing Moon 103 is meant to close at center front, and I could have used it as is, but I wanted a detachable collar that closed at the center back, so I adjusted the pattern piece. From Dressmaking Up to date, it is always advisable to close the collar at the back, whether the waist closes at the front, the back, or even the side. I cut the black velvet on the straight grain and then cut a matching piece of horsehair canvas. From home dressmaking in 1892, canvas or buckram must be used for the interlining or foundation of all standing collars. Crinoline or lighter stiff materials will not give the desired firmness. A standing collar should be so stiff it will not, with the ordinary wear, wrinkle or crease. I removed the seam allowance from the canvas interlining piece and trimmed the seam allowance on the velvet outer collar piece. I used a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance everywhere except the top of the collar, where I used a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then I folded the velvet seam allowances onto the canvas and stitched them down to the canvas. At the top edge of the collar, I snipped the velvet to help it lay flat along the curve. At the short ends of the collar, I used a whip stitch to secure the seam allowances to help keep everything nice and flat. I then sewed 2 pairs of large hooks and eyes to the short ends of the collar. I was able to cut the lining for the collar from a somewhat matching scrap of olive silk charmeuse. This olive silk came from the same estate sale from which I got the rest of the fabric for this project. I pressed in and trimmed the seam allowances on the collar lining. If you'd prefer your collar to be permanently attached, you can sew half of it onto the bodice, from the center back across the right shoulder to the right center front. Finish off the exposed left side of the neckline with binding or a strip of fabric, and then sew on the collar lining to conceal the seam allowances. I carefully pinned the lining to the collar and sewed it on using black silk thread. Like with the bodice center front lining, I positioned the collar lining so that it would cover the anchoring points of the hooks and eyes. I think a stiffer silk for the collar lining, like taffeta, would have given the collar more body. But I'm all for using what you have, and I wasn't about to buy a yard of silk taffeta when I only needed a few inches of it. And with that, the detachable collar is complete. The black velvet is fairly neutral, so I should be able to use this collar on other 1890s bodices. I decided to finish the raw edge of the neckline with a short standing collar made of the wool fabric cut on the bias. This gives me a sturdy foundation to sew the detachable collar onto, and if anything shifts out of place, it shouldn't be noticeable with the matching fabric. Another option would be to use seam binding to finish the neckline, but that looked too narrow to sufficiently cover the raw edges for this particular bodice. However, the bias cut wool standing collar did appear to add extra bulk to the neckline despite my best efforts, and the neck area is a bit tight. I might replace this with a shorter bias cut strip of matching silk. After sewing on the bias strip of wool, right sides together, I clipped and trimmed the seam allowances. Then I folded the bias strip in half lengthwise, pressed in the seam allowance on the long edge, and basted it in place, covering all raw edges of the neckline. I sewed it down with whip stitches. I then sewed the finished velvet collar onto the neckline, from the center back to the right side center front, somewhat awkwardly. To secure the collar on the left side of the neckline, I made a series of thread bars along the stand collar. Each bar corresponds with a hook on the lower edge of the detachable velvet collar. To make the bars, I used a doubled up matching thread to make an initial loop on the outside of the stand collar. I tightened the loop around a pair of small scissors. Then I sewed buttonhole stitches over the loop to strengthen and stiffen it. You're probably not supposed to work buttonhole stitches from right to left, but that's how I did it, and it worked out in the end. The bodice is now functionally complete, but there are a few finishing touches we can add for better fit and wear. There are few forms but require some padding into perfect shape. Perhaps it is only a little over the bust, perhaps a hollowness under the arms or over the collarbones must be filled in, says Home Dressmaking from 1892. I decided to make my bust pads removable so that I could use them with other garments. So instead of placing the padding between the outer fabric and lining or otherwise sewing the padding to the lining directly, I made each bust pad as a completely finished unit. Dressmaking Up to Date says, if any padding is needed, a few layers of sheet wadding, decreasing in size, so it may grow thinner toward the edges, may be basted around the armhole from front shoulder to back shoulder. I drew a general shape for padding around my bust and underarm area, and cut 3 pieces for each pad gradually smaller in size. I used some unbleached cotton batting from my stash. I sewed the pad pieces together with a large whip stitch, arranging the pad pieces so that they stacked on top of each other with minimal bulk at the outer edges. The bust pads will be encased in fabric to keep them from getting pilled and linty. From the lining fabric, I cut out 4 padding cover pieces the size of the largest pad plus seam allowance. I sewed 2 pad cover pieces together, leaving a few inches unsewn so that I could turn the pad covers right side out and fit the pads in. I used pinking shears to trim the seam allowances, which was so much faster than clipping the curve all around the pad covers. The pad covers were then flipped right side out and pressed. I stuffed the pads into the pad covers and then sewed up the opening with a ladder stitch. I then positioned the completed bust pads in the bodice. I used a herringbone stitch to secure them in place. This stitch will be easy to remove when I move the bust pads to another garment. I only stitched around the armhole and upper bust area. The final detail is a waist stay to help ease the tension on the garment closure and keep the garment correctly placed on the body. Cut a belt of the webbing, which is sold for the purpose. Make it 3 inches longer than the waist measure. Turn back 1 inch and 1/2 at each end, sew a hook on one end and an eye on the other, and hem the raw edges over them. Mark the center of this belt and sew it to the center front seam if the waist opens in the back, or the center back if it is made to open in the front, and to the seam immediately next to the center, also on each side of it. Make the lower edge of the belt 1/2 inch above the waistline. Sew firmly across the width of the belt with a long cross stitch to the inside of the seam. I followed these instructions as best as I could and used Petersham ribbon from my stash to make the belt or waist stay. My ribbon seemed a bit wider than the belt webbing Dressmaking Up to Date referred to, so I sewed 2 pairs of hooks and eyes onto the ends of the belt instead of 1. I really liked the method of hemming the raw ends of the ribbon over the anchoring points of the hooks and eyes to conceal them. I also whip stitched the outer folds of the ribbon hem areas to help keep everything flat and in place. From Suggestions for Dressmakers in 1896, a belt of non-elastic webbing fastened at the waist on the 3 back seams is a necessity in a bodice. The Parisian dressmaker makes this belt noticeably tighter than the outside of the waist in order to keep the bodice from riding up in the back. American dressmakers, to prevent skirts sagging, have laterally attached these belts pretty generally to skirts by means of hooks and eyes at the back. I'm not really sure what that last part means, but perhaps it refers to having the bodice hook onto the skirt at the center back. I adore every detail of this bodice. Every stitch was worth it. It took about 2 months to make, but it feels like clothing rather than a costume. It's a comfortable, versatile piece in my late Victorian wardrobe, and while it isn't perfect, it was a fun chance to explore so many Victorian dressmaking techniques. It does take some patience to fasten all the hooks, but I can put on the bodice by myself and I don't feel constricted or uncomfortable while wearing it. And yes, the Plastron stays perfectly in place even though it doesn't have any fastening. The pattern matching and fullness give the Plastron a seamless appearance. To address the fact that the bodice is too big at my bust, I quickly adjusted the darts, but these will have to be properly fixed by removing the boning and re-sewing the darts. Not something I'm up for right now, as wearing the bodice is more important to me than the perfect bodice. I hope this video inspires you to make your own 1890s bodice and hopefully with bigger sleeves than mine. I'd love to hear in the comments down below if you've made any 1890s garments and what techniques or patterns you used. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like down below and subscribe for more historical sewing tutorials.